"Who are you in love with?" asked Lord Henry after a pause. "With an actress," said Dorian Gray, blushing. "Her name is Sybil Vane. Never heard of her." "No one has, but people will some day. She is a genius." "My dear boy, no woman is a genius. Women are a decorative sex. They never have anything to say, but they say it charmingly. Women represent the triumph of matter over mind, just as men represent the triumph of mind over morals." Those are the words of Lord Henry. He is one of the two big corrupting forces of Dorian Gray, the title character in Oscar Wilde's The Portrait of Dorian Gray. But before we get into it, hello, I'm back after over a year of not posting any videos. I thought I would start again. I've quite enjoyed looking through some of my old videos. It sort of lets me relive many of the books that I've read in the past, and I think it's a great hobby. So I'm back, and here we are. Oscar Wilde, here is a portrait of him, is of course best known as a playwright. This is his one and only novel, and as you may or may not expect from a playwright, the action is all in the dialogue between characters, and it is extremely sharp and subtle and witty and extremely clever dialogue. Oscar Wilde is known as one of the masters of wit, and I tend to agree. So there are a few reasons why I really love this book. It was a break for me. I had been reading a lot of sort of nonfiction and a few technical books, and I wanted to read a good old-fashioned story, and I was not disappointed. Like all things that aspire to literature, The Portrait of Dorian Gray sort of lets you see the world, or maybe see yourself through a bit of a different lens. Like a lot of surprising observations, or observations that are maybe not surprising, is just surprising that you never noticed before, and it just gives you something to think about. It's extremely witty, and then that's very enjoyable, and it's also sort of a communion with an ancient culture. Oscar Wilde was a member of sort of the highest social circles of London society, and you get to see those circles. The book almost entirely takes place sort of between the very upper classes of Britain, and you see their very sort of very status-seeking, a little bit vain, and extremely subtle culture, which is in contrast to today's extremely status-seeking, vain, and vulgar culture. One small criticism of the book is that the plot may be a little bit unsatisfying, because a lot of things happen just by pure chance and not through the faculties of the characters involved. I think it's more fun and engaging. You can relate to the characters more when they're solving the problems using their own powers. For example, and like always, this review will contain spoilers. But for example, there's somebody stalking Dorian Gray to kill him for revenge, and he just gets shot completely by accident, relieving all the danger instantly. So there's a bit of that. There's also a autobiographical element I forgot to mention in this story. It's from the late 19th century. Following his marriage in 1884, Oscar Wilde published several stories ostensibly for children, and the picture of Dorian Gray in 1891. His homosexual relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas was exposed and he was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment in 1895. Released in 1897, he fled to France, where he died a broken man in 1900. So this novel created a lot of scandal for its depictions of homosexuality, although by today's degenerate standards, I must say, they're not even perceptible. It's like just two characters in a garden talking, and you get some flowery depictions of the garden, and that's about it. So it caused a bit of scandal back in his day. So the plot, many people know, it's sort of a story of what do they call it? Divine providence, where someone tries to escape sin and gets punished in the end. Uh, Dorian Gray is an astonishingly handsome young man, and he gets a portrait painted of him. And during sort of a conversation with Lord Henry, a sort of spell seems to get cast where Dorian Gray will not grow old, um, but as a consequence, kind of a Faustian consequence, like all the sin will accumulate on this painting, and the painting will haunt Dorian Gray. So Dorian gets more and more corrupt. His first major sin is just cynicism. He falls in love and then quickly out of love with an actress called Sybil Vane, about whom I read about in the opening, and she ends up killing herself. Later, he causes other members of British aristocracy to get hooked on opium. Dorian murders the artist who painted the painting and blackmails someone into disposing of the body in a very sort of gruesome way, and that causes that person to go a little bit crazy. And in the end, Dorian attempts to plunge a dagger in the painting, which is getting uglier and uglier. So Dorian's beauty is preserved, and all the sin accumulates as ugliness on this painting that in the beginning was astonishingly beautiful as Dorian himself. So he plunges a dagger into the painting, and the dagger ends up in his own back, and he dies. That's the plot. But as I said, the probably the best thing about this story is just Oscar Wilde's unparalleled wit and subtlety of language. And I'll just read a bunch of passages, and we'll conclude the video like that. I have a bunch of pages dog-eared like that, and I'll just flip through them and read and maybe put them in context for your enjoyment. It is an interesting question, said Lord Henry, who found an exquisite pleasure in playing with the lad's unconscious egotism. An extremely interesting question. I fancy that the true explanation is this. As it often happens, the real tragedies of life occur in such inartistic manner that they hurt us by their crude violence, their absolute incoherence, and their absurd want of meaning, their entire lack of style. They affect us as vulgarity affects us. They give us an impression of sheer brute force, and we revolt against it. This passage actually reminded me of being in the military, and how the military just tried to deal with, the catastrophes of, soldiers getting killed or whatever. It was just trying to fit it into some graceful narrative, and it would not always fit. There's some times where people died for extremely stupid reasons. So there's that. One should absorb the color of life, but one should never remember its details. Details are always vulgar. This is Dorian. Dorian thinks about the actress who killed herself for him, or because she was heartbroken over his quick turn of sentiment towards her. I think it was her proposing to sacrifice the whole world for me. That is always a dreadful moment. It fills one with the terror of eternity. They flaunt their conjugal felicity in one's face as if it were the most fascinating of sins. They make one believe in the reality of things we all play with, such as romance, passion, and love. Notice the subtle sort of skepticism there. They make one believe that romance, passion, and love are real. So it takes for granted that they're false, and kind of makes a statement from there. I am afraid, this is a pretty famous quote of Oscar Wilde, and it comes from Lord Henry, one of the two big corrupting forces of young Dorian. I am afraid women appreciate cruelty, downright cruelty, more than anything else. They have wonderfully primitive instincts. We have emancipated them, but they remain slaves looking for their masters all the same. They love being dominated. I am sure you are splendid. I have never seen you really absolutely angry, but I fancy how delightful you looked. Lord Henry complimenting Dorian. Lord Henry says, Life has everything in store for you, Dorian. There is nothing that you, with your extraordinary good looks, will not be able to do. But suppose, Harry, I become haggard and old and wrinkled, what then? Ah, then, said Lord Henry, rising to go, then, my dear Dorian, you will have to fight for your victories. As it is, they are all brought to you. This is Basil, the artist, and Dorian, and Basil seems to have a crush on Dorian, and I can't tell if it's like a homosexual crush or it's just sort of the admiration of an artist admiring beauty. And Basil says, I thought this was real nice. It was not intended as a compliment, it was a confession. It's a very sort of artistic perception there. Oh, this was funny, and for some reason, this is the second thing in the book that reminded me of being in the army. In the army, there's a non-commissioned officers, sergeants sometimes kind of resented if the officers work too much. So here it said, or they're a little territorial, like certain types of work is theirs, and they want the officers to stay away from it. So here there was just a little quip. Something of a load to carry, sir, gasped the little man when they reached the top of the landing and wiped their foreheads. Mr. Hubbard, who had all the tradesman's spirited dislike of seeing a gentleman doing anything useful, Dorian put his hand to it so as to help them. So the servant really hated seeing the gentleman do any actual work. It's the interesting. It's a little bit sad to see these glimpses into sort of British aristocratic culture because, as I understand, it is not completely gone, but it is severely attenuated, not least because of all the British aristocracy that died in the Great War. Their ranks were greatly thinned. So the second corrupting force of Dorian Gray is this strange book that he's given by Lord Henry. And there are many references to this book without ever going into it into detail, and it seems something just downright satanic. It isn't described, it's only in one spot described specifically. Mostly it's just referenced to as this strange novel without a plot. There were in it metaphors as monstrous as orchids and as subtle in color. And so Dorian often retreats somewhere and reads of this corrupting book, satanic book. Here's a really subtle sort of backhanded insult. I didn't say I like it, Harry. I said it fascinated me. There's a difference. Oh, you discovered that, murmured Lord Henry. Which is, I think, calling him an unsophisticated kid who finally discovered a difference about which everyone else already knows. Okay, so there's like one long rant where they describe the contents of that satanic book, which and that's my word, satanic. Nowhere in the novel is described that way, but it has a strong corrupting effect on Dorian, and he retreats and reads the book, and like there's like 2 pages worth of just 2 pages long list of ancient and famous sins, ancient historic sins that sort of presumably shook the world. And it's sort of just the book breathlessly just names all of them. Each one could probably stand on its own as a novel, and you just get sort of this rant of it. Yeah, I don't know where to jump in without reading all of it. In the 7th chapter, he tells how, crowned with laurel, lest lightning might strike him, he had sat as Tiberius in the garden at Capri, reading the shameful books of Elephantis. What? Elephantis? Elephantis? There's a Pizzagate connection there. Wasn't one of the main Pizzagate guys? Didn't he have the last name Elephantis? While dwarves and peacocks strutted around him, and the flute player mocked the swinger of the censer, and as Caligula had crossed with the green-shirted jockeys in the stables and supped on an ivory manger, with a jewel frontleted horse. All right, that wasn't that interesting. Let me see if I could find something more lucid and accessible. Pietro Riario, the young Cardinal Archbishop of Florence, child and minions of Sixtus VI, whose beauty was equaled only by his debauchery, and who received Leonora of Aragon in a pavilion of white and crimson silk filled with nymphs and centaurs, and gilded a boy that he might serve at the feast of Ganymede and Hylas Ezelin, whose melancholy could be cursed only by the spectacle of death. Whose melancholy could be cured only by the spectacle of death, and who had a passion for red blood, and as other men have for red wine, the son of a fiend, as was reported, and one who had cheated his father at dice when gambling with him for his own soul. Giambattista Cibo, who in mockery took the name Innocent, and into whose torpid veins the blood of 3 lads were infused by a Jewish doctor, Sigismondo Malatesta, the lover of Isota and the lord of Rimini, whose effigy was burned at Rome as the enemy of God and man, who strangled Polyssena with a napkin and gave poison to Ginevra d'Este in a cup of emerald, and in honor of a shameful passion built with a pagan church for Christian worship, Charles VI, who had so wildly adored his brother's life that a leper had warned him of the insanity that was coming on him, and who, when his brain had sickened and grown strange, could only be soothed by Saracen cards painted with images of love and death and madness. Anyway, this goes on and on and on, and it's not very lucid, but it's like a vague reference to great sinful events of history. And they're powerful because they're specific. They name names. Some of these people are real historic figures, but I think it succeeds in sort of arousing my curiosity about that great satanic tome. But let's move on. I hope that wasn't too incoherent. Little phrase that I really liked. The mad passions of a hunted animal stirred within him. What nonsense people talk about happy marriages, exclaimed Lord Henry. A man can be happy with any woman as long as he does not love her. From cell to cell of his brain crept the one thought, and the wild desire to live, most terrible of all of man's appetites, quickened into force each trembling nerve and fiber. Ugliness that had once been hateful to him because it made things real became dear to him now for that very reason. Ugliness which had once been hateful to him because it made things real became dear to him for that very reason. Faced with death, he liked reality, even if its imperfections. When he wasn't thinking about death, he disliked ugliness because he sort of lived in this fake beautiful world where there was none. Civilization is not by any means an easy thing to attain, There are only two ways by which man can reach it. One is by being cultured, the other is by being corrupt. Country people have no opportunity for either, so they stagnate. There is a picture of the man, Oscar Wilde, the great playwright who also wrote this not too long, very entertaining novel. And with that, I will conclude my first book review video in many years. I hope it was enjoyable. Cheers.